My parents ignored my kids for years while pouring money into my brother's children. Now that my kids are thriving, they suddenly want back in. And when they called asking to reconnect, the response they got was brutal. It had been years since I'd heard from my parents in any meaningful way. Just the occasional Merry Christmas text, the generic Happy Birthday message. Nothing real, nothing that mattered. And then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. It was my mother, her voice bright and excited, like we'd just spoken yesterday. Like the years of silence and neglect had never happened. She said they'd been thinking. It was time to get back into the kids' lives. They were older now. It had been too long. They wanted to make up for lost time. I felt my stomach drop. Make up for lost time? After everything? Let me back up. My parents have always believed they knew best. About everything. For as long as I can remember, their love had been reserved for my brother, their golden child. He could do no wrong in their eyes, no matter how many mistakes he made or how much trouble he caused. And then there was me, the one who never quite measured up. I'd spent most of my adult life trying to live on my own terms, raising my kids far from their influence. My brother stayed close, basking in their approval. Meanwhile, my kids had been growing up independent, smart, driven, everything my parents never expected them to be. But here's what really hit me. My parents had been so focused on their golden son that they'd barely noticed the success my children were carving out for themselves. They hadn't even acknowledged the trust fund they'd set up for my brother's kids, while my children had been left with nothing. Zero. Not a dollar. Not even a thought. Therefore, when my mother called with that bright, fake enthusiasm, I knew exactly what this was about. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about family. This was about optics. About realizing they'd bet on the wrong horse. I took a deep breath and asked her what she was trying to say. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She said they'd always wanted to be close. And now that the kids were older, it would be nice to catch up, to make up for the time that had passed. She sounded so casual, like nothing had ever been wrong. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind her that it was her and Dad who had pushed my kids away all those years. They let my brother and his family take center stage while mine got the scraps. My children wouldn't just forget that. They had their own sense of pride, and they weren't going to let themselves be manipulated. But they didn't know the full story yet. They didn't know the lengths my parents had gone to, pretending that my brother's kids were more deserving, more worthy. They didn't know about the trust fund. I told her I didn't know if my kids were ready for that. They hadn't forgotten how they'd been treated. There was silence. Then my mother said, almost snobbishly, well, sometimes kids just need to understand that parents make mistakes. It's time to move on from the past. I laughed, bitter and sharp. You mean your mistakes? She sighed, clearly frustrated. We're only trying to help. I hung up. The words were still ringing in my ears. How dare they pretend this was about helping? This wasn't about help. This was about making up for the years they'd lost by not seeing what my kids were capable of. Therefore, I needed to talk to someone. My husband, Alex. He'd been a steady presence through every twisted turn my family had thrown at me. He's an architect, busy, but always there when it matters. That evening, after dinner, while the kids were in their rooms, I told him everything. He raised an eyebrow. What did you say? I told him I'd shut down the idea immediately. Made it clear our kids weren't going to forget how they'd been treated. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. After everything they've done, it's ridiculous for them to expect us or the kids to just forgive and forget. I leaned back, crossing my arms. The worst part? They'd set up a trust fund for my brother's kids, but left nothing for ours. They'd always treated our children like they were inferior, just because of their assumptions about me and Alex. And now, out of nowhere, they wanted to be the ideal grandparents. Alex's jaw tightened. It's obvious they only want to get involved now because they see our kids doing well, not because they genuinely care. He was right, but he was also right about something else. We needed to talk to the kids. Let them know what was going on. Figure out how they felt about it. Therefore, later that evening, I gathered Jake and Lily in the living room. They sat across from me, curiosity mixed with suspicion on their faces. I started by asking if they remembered how their grandparents and I didn't exactly get along. They both nodded. I continued, telling them my parents had reached out recently, saying they wanted to reconnect. They were acting like they wanted to make up for all the lost time. Jake, always the one to speak his mind, rolled his eyes. Seriously? After all these years? I gave him a small nod. That was exactly how I felt. Lily, always more cautious, asked what I meant by make up for lost time. I told her I thought that now that we were doing well on our own, they wanted to be part of the picture. There was a long silence. I could see the disappointment on their faces. Jake spoke up again, clearly frustrated. Are we just supposed to forget about all the times they ignored us? I assured him we weren't. I didn't want them to forgive and forget. I told them both that if they didn't want anything to do with my parents, I'd support that decision. I wasn't going to force them into a relationship with people who hadn't cared about them before. Jake looked at Lily, then back at me. After a moment, he said he didn't know. He admitted he was still angry about how my parents had treated us. Lily nodded in agreement, saying she didn't think she wanted anything to do with them either. Therefore, I told them we'd let my parents know. They didn't need to settle for anyone who hadn't supported them from the beginning. But my parents weren't done. A few weeks passed, and they started escalating. They began calling me, leaving increasingly desperate messages. Then came the guilt card. One night, my phone rang. It was my mom, her voice soft and shaky, as if she were on the verge of tears. She said they'd been trying to reach out to the kids and weren't getting anywhere. She sounded so different, so vulnerable. Then she dropped the bomb. You know, your father and I aren't getting any younger. Our health isn't what it used to be, and we just want to make sure we have some time with your kids before. She trailed off, the unspoken before it's too late, hanging in the air. She added that my father wanted to introduce Jake to the business. It was manipulative, and I knew it. I could feel the guilt creeping in, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about me. It was about my children. My parents had never shown the kind of care they were pretending to now. They hadn't bothered to be there for the milestones, the birthdays, the times when my kids needed support. Therefore, when I talked to Alex that evening, he said exactly what I was thinking. The kids have already made their choice. They've been through enough. You can't force them to forgive, and they shouldn't have to. The next day, I went to Jake and Lily again. Jake didn't even look up when I sat next to him. He sighed. Mom, I don't get it. Why do they think they can just show up and expect everything to be fine? They didn't care when we were growing up. Now all of a sudden, they want to pretend like we're part of the family. Lily joined us. She said quietly, it's not like we hate them. We just don't trust them. They've never been there when we needed them. And I don't think we should have to act like nothing happened just because they're suddenly saying sorry when it's convenient for them. My heart swelled with pride. They were so strong, so clear in their convictions. I told them I understood, that I respected their decision, and that they didn't owe anyone forgiveness if they weren't ready for it. Therefore, the next day, I called my parents. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told them exactly what Jake and Lily had said. They weren't interested in a relationship. They weren't interested in playing pretend. They didn't need their grandparents' approval. Not after all the years of being ignored or belittled. There was a long pause. I could practically hear the gears turning in my mother's head, trying to figure out how to twist the narrative. She tried to recover, saying she just didn't know how to make them understand. I told her it wasn't her job to make them understand anymore. She'd already done enough damage. She'd been doing it for years. After that, there was an uncomfortable silence. I ended the conversation as bluntly as I could. There was no point in saying more. But of course, my brother had a call. I'd been expecting it. His tone was as insufferable as ever. The kind of voice that made it clear he thought he could win anyone over with charm and a few well-chosen words. He said he'd been talking to Mom and Dad. They were really upset. He'd been thinking maybe there was a way we could all come to an agreement. I immediately knew where this was going. He wanted me to soften up, to let bygones be bygones, to pretend like nothing had happened just because their money was on the table. I told him I wasn't interested. We didn't need their help. We'd done just fine without it. But he didn't get the hint. I understand you're upset, but let's be real. The money could make a huge difference, right? The kids could really benefit from it. I've seen how much it's helped my kids. I couldn't help the laugh that escaped me. I told him I knew exactly how much his kids had benefited. They were living in a bubble because of that money, spending it on whatever ridiculous thing they wanted without a second thought. And that included him and his wife. He tried to defend himself, but I didn't let up. I told him he'd been letting them fund his whole life. Him, his wife, his kids, all of them living this lavish existence because he couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. He kept going back for more, and now he was trying to act like he was so much better than me. I paused, letting him process my words. Then I told him his kids were spoiled rotten, acting like money could fix everything. That's all they knew. They didn't have any real sense of work or struggle. They'd been handed everything, and he was setting them up to fail when the bubble popped. It was pathetic. There was silence on his end. I told him I'd been doing just fine without their help. Jake and Lily had been raised with values, with a real work ethic. We'd built our own success, and that was more than I could say for him or his kids. He tried to gather his composure. He said his kids were thriving. They weren't like mine. They were living the life they deserved. I cut him off sharply. Your kids are thriving on other people's hard work. They haven't earned a damn thing, but they'll earn soon enough. And so will you, when that money runs out. There was a long pause. Finally, he sighed. I don't know why you have to be so difficult about this. All I'm offering is help. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. You're not offering help. You're offering to let me fall into the same trap you have. No thanks. Therefore, the conversation was over. He wasn't going to change my mind, and I wasn't going to change his. But it felt good to finally say the things I've been holding back for so long. It felt good to remind him that he had no moral high ground to stand on. Not when he'd been living off my parents' handouts all these years. Here's what people don't understand about family money. It's never free. It comes with strings, expectations, the silent agreement that you'll bend to their will because they're helping you. My brother took the bait. He let them fund his life, his kids' lives, and now he's stuck. He can't leave. He can't stand on his own. He's trapped in a golden cage, and he doesn't even see it. My kids? They're free. They work for what they have. They understand the value of earning something, of building it yourself. They don't owe anyone their success, and they never will. My parents thought they were making a smart investment by pouring everything into my brother's family. They thought his kids would be the ones to carry on the legacy, to make them proud. But what they didn't realize is that handouts don't build character. They build dependency. Jake and Lily didn't need their grandparents' money to succeed. They needed role models who showed them what real work looked like. They needed parents who believed in them, not because of what they could get from them, but because of who they were. And that's exactly what Alex and I gave them. Some people think I'm being too harsh, that I should take the high road, accept the olive branch, let my parents back into our lives. But those people don't understand what it's like to watch your children be dismissed, overlooked, and written off by people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. My parents made their choice years ago. They chose my brother. They chose his kids. They chose a version of success that came with conditions and control. And now they're shocked that we don't want any part of it. The truth is, I don't need their validation anymore. I spent too many years trying to prove something to people who didn't care. And my kids? They never needed it in the first place. They've always known their worth. They've always known they could build something real without shortcuts or handouts. So yeah, my parents ignored my kids for years while bankrolling my brother's family. And now that mine are thriving without them, they want back in, but the door's been closed, locked, and honestly, I threw away the key a long time ago. Because here's the atomic takeaway. Love that shows up only when you're successful was never really love. It was an investment they're trying to cash in on. And some investments, you're better off never accepting.